Chapters 10, 11, and 12 of the Story of Joan of Arc by Andrew Lang. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 10. How Joan led the Dauphin to be crowned. We may think that Joan's best plan would have been to attack the English in Paris at once, while they were still in a fright after their great defeat at Pathay. But she thought that if the Dauphin was once crowned and anointed with the holy oil at Rheims, the French who were of the English party would join him more readily. Robert the Bruce, in the same way, had himself crowned at Scone, which in Scotland was the usual place for coronations, when he had only very few followers and very little chance of beating the English. Rheims, as you can see on the map, is a long way farther from Orleans than Paris on the northeast. But Joan made up her mind to drag the Dauphin to Rheims to be crowned. The Dauphin was lingering at Guyenne, which is some distance south of Orleans, instead of being at the head of his army and in front of the fighting where he should have been. His lazy and cowardly favourites told him that it was a long way to Rheims, and on the road there were several towns with strong walls and castles full of Englishmen and Burgundians, who would not let him pass. Joan answered that she knew this very well and cared nothing about it. All the towns and castles would yield and open their gates. So she left the Dauphin to do as he pleased, and went away with her company into the country. The Dauphin had no money to pay his troops, but men-at-arms came in, hundreds of them, saying that they would fight for the love of the Maid and of chivalry. No doubt they would have been very glad to crown her in place of the stupid Dauphin, but the French law did not allow it, and Joan wanted nothing for herself, only to make France free, and go back to her mother, as she said. However, the Dauphin, who was grateful in his lazy way, made her and her brothers, Peter and John, nobles, and gave her a coat of arms, a sword supporting the crown, with the lilies of France on each side, and changed their name to Dulies. But Joan never used her coat of arms, but bore a dove, silver, on a blue shield. Her brothers were with her, and seemed to have fought very well, though in most ways they were quite ordinary young men. When Joan went away, the Dauphin made up his mind at last to march to Rheims, going first to Troyes, a strong town on the road. All the castles and fortresses on the way, instead of resisting him, submitted to him, as Joan had said that they would. At Troyes, where he came on 8th July, the English garrison and the people of the town who were on the English and Burgundian side wanted to oppose him. They fought on the 8th and 9th of July. The Dauphin's advisers did not want to fight, the brave Dunois tells us, but Joan said, "Gentle Dauphin, bid your army besiege the town, and do not hold these long councils, for in 3 days I will bring you into the town." Then down she went to the great ditch, or fosse, round the town, and worked harder, says Dunois, than 2 or 3 of the most famous knights could have done. The people of Troyes then yielded to Joan, and they had a great feast in the city, which they needed, for the army had been living on soup made from the beans in the fields. Then they went on to Rheims, and the Archbishop and all the people came out to meet them, with shouts of joy. On 17th July, the Dauphin, with Joan and all his nobles, went to the cathedral, and there he was crowned and anointed, and made king in earnest, Joan standing beside him with her banner in her hand. This was her happiest day, perhaps, and the last of her great days. She had done so much. In the beginning of May there was every chance that the English would take Orleans, and sweep across the Loire and seize all France, and drive the Dauphin into Spain, or across the sea to Scotland, and the France would have been under the English for who knows how long. But in 2 months Joan had driven the English behind the walls of Paris, and her Dauphin was king indeed. Then the Maid knelt at the king's feet and wept for joy, in the great cathedral, among the splendid nobles, and the lights and the bright-coloured coats of arms and the sweet smoke of incense. "Gentle King," she said, calling him King for the first time, "now is the will of God fulfilled." And the knights themselves wept for joy. Somewhere in the crowd was an elderly countryman in his best clothes, Joan's father, whom now she saw for the first time since she left her village, and for the last time in her life. The king asked her to choose a gift and reward, and she asked that the people of her village, Domremy, should be free from paying taxes, and they were made free and never paid taxes again for 300 years. On the books of the accounts of money paid by every town and village of France is written, after the names of Domremy and the village nearest it, Greux, nothing, for the sake of the Maid. The paper in which the king ordered that they should pay nothing may still be seen, dated the last of July, 1429. How glad the people at Domremy must have been when Joan's father came home with the good news. This was the last glad day of the Maid. As she rode to Rheims, some people from Domremy met her and asked her if she was afraid of nothing. "Of nothing but treachery," she said, and from this day she met treachery among the king's advisers, who held long councils and did not fight. As she rode from Rheims towards Paris, the people shouted round her, and she said that they were kind people, and she would like to be buried in their cathedral, she who was never to be buried in the earth. "Joan," said the Archbishop, "in what place do you expect to die?" "Where God pleases, for of that hour and that place I know nothing more than you do. But would to God that now I might take off my armour and go home to my father and mother," for, as she had seen her father, she was longing for her mother more than ever. After this, the people about the king, and the king himself, did not obey Joan, and all went wrong. Chapter 11. How the Maid was betrayed at Paris. The French should have followed the Maid straight to Paris, as she bade them do. But they went here and went there, and one day their army and that of the Duke of Bedford met, but did not fight, and another day there were skirmishes between the English and the Scots, who fought very bravely, says the Burgundian knight Enguerrand de Monstrelet, who wrote a history of those times. The strong town of Compiègne, which had often been taken and retaken, yielded to Joan's army, and the king stayed there, doing nothing, which was what he liked, and the Duke of Burgundy gave him excuses for loitering by sending ambassadors, and pretending that he would give up Paris, for at this time there was no English garrison there. The poor people of the town were on the side of Joan and the king, and now, when the English were out of the great city, was the time to take it. But the king kept hoping to make peace with the Duke of Burgundy. So Joan, with her friend the Duke of Alençon, went to Saint Denis, quite close to Paris, where the kings of France used to be buried. Saint Denis was the saint of France, as Saint George was the saint of England, and Saint Andrew of Scotland. There fought the Duke and the Maid, but the king came on very slowly, while Joan was in the front of the battle every day, at one gate of Paris or another. At last, by often going to him and urging him to come, Alençon brought the king to Saint Denis, but not before a strong new English army had arrived in the town, of which the walls and towers were very high and thick, and the fosses broad and deep and full of water. Then Joan led on her men and the dukes, with her banner in her hand, and cried them on to break down a gate called the Porte Saint-Honoré. Percival de Cagny, who rode under the standard of Alençon, was in the battle, and he says, "The fight was long and fierce, and it was wonderful to hear the noise of guns and culverins from the walls, and to see the arrows fly like clouds. Few of those who went down into the dry ditch with the Maid were hurt, though many others were wounded with arrows and stone cannon balls, but by God's grace and the Maid's favour, there were none but could return without help. We fought from noon till darkness began, After the sun set, the Maid was wounded by a bolt from a crossbow in the thigh, but she only shouted louder to "Come on, and the place was ours." But when it was dark, and all were weary, men came from the King and brought her up out of the ditch against her will. Next day the Maid rose early, and went to the Duke of Alençon, who never failed her. The trumpets blew, and a new ally came, the Baron de Montmorency, with 60 gentlemen and their men-at-arms, and they were riding to attack Paris again, when the King sent messengers to forbid them to do as their hearts desired. So they had to go see him at Saint Denis. But the Duke of Alençon was having a bridge of wood thrown across the river Seine at a new place, and they meant to cross by that bridge next day, and attack Paris again. Shameful to say, the King had that bridge taken to pieces during the night, and when Joan and the Duke led their men there next day, they found only the river, which they could not ford. So the King of France saved Paris from d'Alençon and the Maid. Richard I of England would have battered down the Paris gate with his own battle-axe. Henry V or James IV of Scotland or Prince Charlie would have been foremost in the fight. But this King of France, Charles VII, unworthy of his country and his ancestors, sneaked off to his pretty little town of Guienne on the Loire. And thus was the will of the Maid broken, and the army of the King, says Percival de Cagny. The Duke of Alençon kept his men together, and told the King that, if he would let the Maid ride with him, they would march into Normandy and attack the English where they were strongest. But the King would not hear of it, and the Maid, with almost a broken heart, hung up her armour at the altar of Saint Denis in his cathedral. Half of her year was spent, and the King made her stay with him in the towns on the Loire, when he might have been in Paris, his capital, if he had only trusted Joan. In the meantime the English retook some of the French towns that Joan had given to the King, and seized her sacred armour in the church of Saint Denis, and punished and plundered the people, who were worse off than before, while the Maid was only allowed now and then to attack the English and defeat them in the old way. Chapter 12. How the Maid took certain towns. The wise King had arranged with the Duke of Burgundy that they two should be at peace till Easter 1430, while he might fight the English as much as he liked, which was not at all. Now the English let the Duke of Burgundy be governor of Paris. It was always Paris that the Maid wished to take for her king, as it was the greatest city and the capital of France. But the King said she must not attack Paris, for it was now under the Duke of Burgundy, not under the English. All this was mere pretence, to avoid fighting. Joan's aim was to turn the English and their child king, Henry VI, out of her country, and the English were not likely to go out till they were driven out. The English still held towns on the river Loire, such as Saint-Pierre-le-Moustier and La Charité. Joan went to Bourges and gathered an army, with a gentleman named Delbret to help her, and besieged the town of Saint-Pierre-le-Moustier. When they had battered the walls for some time with their guns and made a breach, the French tried to rush through it, but the English were too strong and too many, and drove them out. At this time Joan's master of the household, d'Aulon, who had been with her at Orléans, was wounded in the heel by an arrow, and he could not walk without crutches. He saw that while the rest of the French had retired out of shot from the breach, Joan was there almost alone, with a very small company. d'Aulon therefore got a horse, and rode to her to ask her to come out of danger. "What are you doing here alone?" he asked her. She took off her helmet and said, "I am not alone. Here I have with me 50,000 of my own," by which she seems to have meant an invisible army of angels, "and I will not leave this place till I take the town." d'Aulon told her that she had but 4 or 5 men with her, to which she only answered by bidding him to make her army bring faggots of wood to fill up the ditch with, that they might cross to the town. Then she shouted in a loud voice, "Bring up faggots, all of you!" And they obeyed, filling up the ditch, attacked the breach in the wall again, rushed through, beat the English, and took the town. This was just like what Joan had done when her army was on the point of retreating from the attack on Les Tourelles at Orléans. One charge more was what she called for, and her men were inspired with courage, while the English were terrified by their refusal to be beaten. This was the last time that Joan led the French to such a victory. She besieged another town, La Charité, which was held by Burgundians, but the king did not send food enough for her men, and she had to go away unsuccessful. About this time she was troubled by a woman called Catherine of La Rochelle, a married woman, who declared that a lovely lady came to her at night, dressed all in cloth of gold, and told her where treasures of money were hidden, which were much needed for the wars. Joan said that she must see this wonderful lady before she could believe in her, and she sat up all night with Catherine, but the lady never came. Joan told Catherine to go back to her husband and her children and mind her own affairs. There were several people who went about saying that they had visions, but they were of no use, for visions or none, they had not Joan's courage and wisdom. It is true that Catherine might have said to Joan, "You can't see my golden lady, but I can't see your saints, nor hear your voices." The difference was that Joan's saints and voices had enabled her to do a great many wonderful things, while Catherine's golden lady never led to the finding of treasures or anything else that was of any use. End of chapter 12.